My name is Gill. When I lived in Bogota, Colombia, and served as head of parks, I led the construction of over 200 parks, mostly in low-income areas. Now, I live in Toronto, Canada, and 16 years ago created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization based on a simple but powerful concept. What if everything we did in our cities had to be great for an 8-year-old and for an 80-year-old as indicator species? Then it would be good for all. I have been fortunate to have worked in over 350 different cities in all continents. This web talk, A Walk in the Park with Gill, is a way of giving back. Every other week, I invite fascinating people to present captivating stories of parks, people, and cities. Then, you and I have a dialogue with our guest. So, Tim, let's start with you. Can you please share your screen and tell us a little bit about the cities, the urban playground?
Thank you very much, Gill. And thank you for this invitation, this opportunity. And thank you also for setting up these events. It's wonderful to see already nearly 300 people are joining us. It's terrific. So I'm going to really give you a whistle-stop tour of my book. You can see the title there, I hope, Urban Playground, How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities. And it's all about children's relationship with the built form, with the fabric of cities and neighborhoods. And when we're thinking about children's lives, I think one good place to start is to think about our own childhoods and the kind of relationship we had when we were growing up with our neighborhoods. And my next slide, I think, helps to get a handle on how that relationship has been changing over the generations. So I hope you can see a map, and this map, it shows what you might call is the home territory or the roaming range of 4 children, and they're in 4 generations of the same family, and it's their roaming range at the age of 8 years old. And all of these children grew up in the same city. So it's a little experiment, if you like, and you can see the big red blob that takes up most of the map. That's the home territory of the great-grandfather in this family. Over 100 years ago now, he could travel 6 miles, 10 kilometers across the city on his own. And you can see how the circles shrink with each generation until we get to this yellow dot here, the top left. That's the range of the son in this family. Also at the age of 8, he's actually allowed to go to the end of his street. We know, by the way, that's more everyday freedom, more of a license to roam than most 8-year-old children get here in the UK. This is a British family. So what you're seeing is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's one of the most important and insightful and yet underexplored changes in the nature of children's lives. And a big reason why this is happening is because of the way we build our towns and cities and neighborhoods. So I think when we think about what a good childhood looks like and feels like, thinking about children's everyday freedoms is a great place to start. And by the way, this is just one case study, but since I've been writing and sharing about this, I've had people submit their own examples. So we see the same pattern of children's horizon shrinking over the generations in other parts of the world as well, as you can see with these 4 more maps. And so this speaks to, on the one hand, children's appetite for experience and adventures and exploration, and on the other hand, how social changes and physical changes are restricting them, to the degree that today the most common piece of the city, or the way that we kind of respond to children's appetite for experience, is to create spaces like this one. And if there's one message from my book, it's that actually playgrounds are, they may be have a role to play, but they are not enough to get a healthy childhood and a good journey through children's lives as they grow up. So I'm just going to look a bit more about what I do mean by child-friendly urban planning, why I think it matters, and a brief thought on how to get things to happen. So that's the pattern. So what is child-friendly urban planning? And you can see here a diagram that pulls out the 2 dimensions of child-friendly urban planning. It's the most important diagram in my book, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining it. But in essence, I'm saying that a child-friendly place, city or neighborhood, has 2 dimensions. One dimension is, if you like, it's the things to do dimension. It says there's a lot of choice in a neighborhood. There is nature, there is play spaces, there are places where children can meet their friends, things are nearby. And then the other aspect is the children's mobility. How easy is it for children to get around on their own or with their caregivers? And crucially, of course, for children, that means getting around on foot or by bike. And so let's just look at these different quadrants of this framework. So there are some places where children have very little freedom to get around. And even if they did, there's nothing for them to do. It's a cell. They're trapped, but there's nothing outside. There are some neighborhoods or places where maybe children do have a fair amount of freedom, but their freedom just reveals to them the boring and sterile nature of their own environment. And this is a refugee camp in Jordan. That's a really extreme example. On the other hand, there are neighborhoods and children growing up who maybe live in quite vibrant parts of the world. This is in Recife in Brazil, where I visited. This is 2 blocks back from a wonderful beachfront, lively, joyous place. And yet the children living in this apartment block may as well be 100 miles away because their lives are entirely constrained. It's as if they're in a glass house. They can see through, but they can't actually get to enjoy any of these offers and experiences. So it's only where you have both high levels of mobility and a rich set of offers in a neighborhood that you're in that child-friendly quadrant. So what does this look like in practice? In my book, I talk about the ultimate child-friendly neighborhood. And there's a question mark there. It's deliberate. It's not a cut and paste. But this is the eco-suburb of Vauban, which is part of the German city of Freiburg. You can see from this aerial view, it's high density or medium high density. But when you get to the street level, it's where it's really interesting, because Vauban is in essence a car-free neighborhood. Very low levels of car ownership, and anyone who does own a car, you're not actually able to park it on the street. You have to park it in a car park. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what Vauban is like. There's a lot of green space. There's a lot of opportunities for play, but there actually aren't really any segregated fenced off playgrounds. Rather, the play offers are woven into the fabric of the public space. The streets are very human scale, lively, very easy and safe for walking and cycling. Every time I've visited Vauban twice, and on both occasions I've visited over several days, and always seen the whole of the space between the buildings is full of people enjoying spending time in the space as families, with friends. It's a remarkable place to visit. And here you can see images of the big car park around the edge of the neighborhood to take the cars out of the picture, and also great public transport. So in fact, there's really very little need for many families to own a car. So that's the picture I offer in the book as a kind of lighthouse or a compass point that I think neighbours should be moving towards and that we should be thinking of when we're planning and changing cities. And I boil that down into a diagram. I'm not going to talk in detail about this now, but in essence, a lot of what I'm talking about here is a compact, sustainable urban planning and design. But then there's a child-friendly layer into that, which is thinking more about play, more about how children get around on their own and with caregivers. And that's the picture I'm painting. In my book, I look at about a dozen cities and distill some of the lessons that these are all cities. They may not be particularly child-friendly now, but they are taking seriously this vision. And I'm very grateful to Ceci and her colleagues from Bernard Van Leer Foundation, and also to the Churchill Fellowship, an NGO based here in London, for their support in allowing me to visit these cities. And one of the things I was really interested in was why is it that cities were investing their time and money into this topic? And this next diagram, this Venn diagram, groups the cities together depending on their interest. And what I found was that some cities were clearly interested in children's rights, children's health, and their well-being. So that was center stage for them. But then there was a group of cities that were actually more interested in sustainability or community, the links between making somewhere child-friendly and making it more environmentally sustainable. And then there's a third group of cities that actually had quite hard-nosed economic reasons for this interest. They'd grasped this crucial insight for a city, which is that a city that is not able to attract and retain families is a city whose long-term economic future is bleak. But one of the striking things about the cities I visited was that there were multiple reasons for interest. There were the win-wins, in other words, that by tackling economic challenges, you also tackled the environment. Now, I'm going to speed up now because I'm conscious of time. I just want to say that one of the stories here from London, where I live, that encapsulates the harm done by poor planning is the impact of air pollution on children. And it's tragic, and it's a growing problem in many parts of the world. But also we know that cities that do well by children, where children have high levels of mobility, also are cities and countries where where children have high levels of well-being. And this is a UNICEF study using UNICEF data that shows this. So I want to come now to my model for change. And this is, if you like, the recipe or the formula that I'm offering in the book about how to build programs that really potentially go to scale and take seriously the goal of creating more child-friendly cities. And at the heart of what I call a hub and spoke model is this idea of a catalyst in the municipality, an official, often supported by a politician, who gets things to happen, who works with planning and with transport and parks, who knows how to involve communities and children effectively, has a clear focus on residential neighborhoods, investment on spaces and mobility, and is measuring the difference that these programs make. And to close, I just want to offer one more city, I think, as a revealing example of how effective and far-reaching this can be. And I know Gill and Ceci, you're both familiar with the city of Tirana, the capital city of Albania, a city with a lot of problems, but where they've had a huge impact through taking a children's lens and creating playgrounds, flagship parks, redesigned city centres, and orbital forests, lots of measures. But the key thing about Tirana is they've realised that children are a lens to focus debate about the future of the city and how the city can be made more livable, more sustainable for everyone by creating a collective vision for the future of the city. And that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Very, very interesting. And I'm sure that the audience is going to have a lot of questions, and we'll have a wonderful dialogue. And now we're going to hear from Sarah Milligan Toffler, the Executive Director of Children and Nature Network. That is a magnificent organization that works at all levels, mostly across the US, but also providing advice everywhere. Sarah, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, the organization, and anything else that people are eager to learn about? What is the impact? I think that there has been a lot of, obviously, many negative things of the pandemic. But one positive is that it seems that people all of a sudden realize that nature is not only looks nice, but that is actually good for physical and mental and emotional health. So it has been a major step that is almost known by everybody. So your organization and what you are about to say is even more relevant today than what it would have been 2 years ago.
Thanks, Gill. Just going to share my screen here. All right. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Gill, and thanks for that really wonderful overview, Tim. We think a lot about the roaming radius is what is kind of how we have referred to the shrinking areas that are available to children and communities, and something that we're very concerned with. As Gill said, I'm Sarah Milligan Toffler. I'm the president and CEO of the Children in Nature Network. Very briefly, our mission is to increase equitable access to nature so that children and the natural world can thrive. Children need nature and nature needs children. It's reciprocal. Thank you. It's hard to say. But I just want to say, we really do believe, and Tim, you kind of highlighted this, that nature is an underutilized resource that exists in every community. I mean, nature really is everywhere. Even in spaces that, where like some of the pictures you showed, Tim, of housing developments, you can look at the sky. So kind of starting from a place of recognizing that nature is everywhere. And it's freely available to all of us to reduce stress, to build belonging, and to increase resilience so that young people can reach their full potential, which is something that everyone wants. We also know that too often the color of one's skin or economic background, ability level, really does dictate whether or not folks have access to safe nearby nature. And COVID, as you mentioned, Gill, I mean, it's highlighted how important nature is, but it's also highlighted disparities. And so we're kind of dealing with kind of recognizing that. So I think the challenge I would like to put out to all of us today is, as communities, as we're rebuilding, as we're thinking about how we live with this pandemic to the future, that we don't make the mistakes of the past in terms of sort of thinking about, well, you only have transportation or parks, or you only have access to food or education. I mean, people need all of these things to thrive. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit today about some of what that's going to look like, or what it can look like. I'll just say very briefly, the Children in Nature Network, as Gill mentioned, we work across primarily the United States, but we do have a global network. And the way in which we work, we really believe it's important to foster belief that connection to nature is critical to children's healthy development. People have to believe it and understand it in order to make change. And so we do a lot of collecting and curating of research. We have the largest collection of scientific literature on the human and nature connection, freely available on our website. I encourage you to check it out. And then we do a lot of strategic communications. We hire journalists who are to tell stories that aren't being told on the mainstream media. Secondly, we really think it's important, and Tim, you kind of touched on this. You really have to impact systems that can that have a say in what children's lives look like. And so, for example, and I'll talk a little bit about this today, we work with the National League of Cities and municipal leaders across the United States to think about holistically, what does equitable access to nature look like in a city? Who does and doesn't have access? And what are the strategies that they can employ to really make that possible, to make the benefits of nature possible for every child in their community? And then we're really working to kind of grow the movement, the people that see this connection to nature being relevant to their lives, to their work. And we actually, one of the things that we do in our movement building work is to host an international conference. We'll be in Atlanta in May. Invite everyone to check that out. The information is on our website, and invite you to join us in person or virtually. We will have many virtual options for this conference. So that's just a little bit about the Children in Nature Network. But really what I want to talk about today is specifically, I want to go a little deep into one strategy that we're seeing many cities that we're working with adopt, and that is incorporating nature play into their parks. And so, as the slide indicates, I mean, research and many of our personal experience, right, tells us that just spending time exploring, playing, learning in nature makes children happier, makes all of us feel happier. We know that there are many health benefits, most notably, mental health benefits. And we know that time spent exploring in nature actually improves academic outcomes. So lots of good reasons to do this. Okay, there we go. Let's see here, sorry. Oh, that's where I wanted to be. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, one of the things that we know is that many children are not experiencing nature's benefits because they don't really have access to safe nearby nature. And I will say, Gill, you were talking about the fact that during COVID, people really recognize, sort of that nature isn't just a nice to have, like we all need it for our mental and physical well-being and as a refuge. What we know is that during COVID-19, children of every demographic background were spending less time outdoors during COVID-19. It hasn't, and we also know, and this is a correlation, not a causation necessarily, but we also know that there are alarming rates of increase of mental health issues with children under the age of 15. So, online school, all of those things, children not being able to go outside and meet up with friends really has had a big impact. Okay, I can't tell if my screen is moving forward. There we go. So I just want to share that there are innovative cities that are helping kids thrive by thinking about how do they integrate nature play into existing parks, empty lots, those kinds of things. So these are some of the cities that we are working with in the US who have done citywide scans to say, which children do have access to nature in our communities? What are those barriers? Is it transportation? Is it, access to things to do, as you were saying, Tim? And then many of these cities have asked children, what would you like to see happen? And then they're creating strategies. And all of these cities have determined that young children in their communities, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, don't have access to good nature-based play, and that's something that they can incorporate into their parks. So, what are nature play spaces? Very simply, they're outdoor spaces that allow children to explore and play with hands-on activities. It could really be that simple. Key features are often things like boulders, logs, loose natural elements like you see these children playing with, etc. And what we know is that so much of children's play today is adult directed, right? We know that for children's healthy development, that nature-based play really allows for kid-directed play, which is really proven to support mental health, executive function, social skills, and academic success. So lots of good reasons to do this. So let's just talk about some of the cities that are making nature play a reality. In Austin, Texas, the City Parks Department is partnering with the Transportation Department, and they've teamed up with Safe Routes to School and other programs to design and fund paths and trails that inspire exploration and adventure. So, these are the kinds of partnerships that can come together to make these kinds of things happen. Back one. Sorry. We know that kids love to play and learn around water. And obviously there are safety concerns, but small ponds and streams can provide wildlife habitat and opportunities to explore and discover, like you see these children doing. We know that these features can also help with stormwater management, which can mitigate effects of climate change. In Chicago, for example, the Chicago Public Schools has partnered with the city water department. the water department has provided $1 million per school in the city of Chicago to transform, paved school grounds into stormwater capture. And then on top of that, our outdoor learning spaces, gardens, ball fields, all wonderful places that are used by the school community and the school during the school day and the broader community. They really are school parks outside of the school day. So these are the kind, and we're seeing around the country that these water department partnerships can be a way to really fund outdoor learning and play spaces. We know that multi-level play areas like this one in Milwaukee, get kids climbing, crawling, moving, develop strength, balance. And what's cool in Milwaukee, they're partnering with the forestry department. So, when trees fall during storms or they're doing regular maintenance and trimming, rather than throwing that stuff out, they deliver it to local parks. And then the wood chips and the logs and these kinds of things are then used for play areas for children. And I will say, I was actually at a park in Austin, Texas recently that had a play, looked like a child's play space like this. There was a guy walking around and he was picking up these logs and using it, for his exercise, which I thought was really creative and fun to see. So these really, while they may be designed for children, they really have appeal and use for people of all ages. So, I just would say in closing that nature play is really an easy, affordable, and practical way to help children reach their full potential. And, really hope that, all of us think about ways to sort of bring these simple ideas to our parks departments and encourage the incorporation of more nature play to support children's full potential. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a very, very interesting in nature, and we are gonna have a dialogue afterwards. But before we have the dialogue, we're gonna have a presentation by Cecilia Vaca-Jones. Cecilia was a minister at the national level in Ecuador. Now she's based in the Netherlands. And 1 week she might be working in Addis Ababa, and the next week in Tel Aviv, and then Sao Paulo, cities of different sizes, of different ethnicities, different economic situations, because this is not just about the big cities or the small cities or the wealthy or the poor, but it's about children everywhere. Cecilia, welcome. Please tell us about you, about Bernard Van Leer, Urban 95, and then and share your screen, and we are eager to learn from you.
Thank you, Gill, for that great introduction. And thank you, Tim and Sarah, because I think that what we're going to be discussing and sharing with you is very relevant just to understand. And now that you mentioned, Gill, because I do think that after having worked for government and now working for the philanthropic sector, and see how working in the planning and design of city actually depends on how much collaboration we can put together with different stakeholders, right? And this is, and I think this kind of spaces where we can share different ideas, different successful experiences that happen around the world, really allow us to inspire others, to inform others of which are some of the good solutions that can work in every different context we work in. So let me start just very briefly saying that the Bernard Van Leer Foundation has been working on early childhood development for over 50 years. So we really center our work on the youngest population. And I do want to say this because only in 2016, we started being interested in working in cities and just trying to understand which is the best way that we can support governments and different stakeholders, improve the way that we can ensure the well-being of young children in any city around the world. And what I find it fascinating through the work that we do in Urban 95 is really understanding how much we need to emphasize on cross-sectorial work and just really understanding that in order to ensure the well-being of children, it is not only about like ensuring good services, but actually really ensuring that the environment where children are being raised is the adequate environment to promote positive connections. So let me share my screen so you can understand a little bit better what I'm talking about. But as you were explaining, Gill, the first question that we started asking when we worked in cities was around if you could experience the city from 95 centimeters, which is usually the size of a healthy 3-year-old child, what would you do? What would you do differently? If you're an urban planner, if you're the mayor, if you're the architect, the engineer, what are the kind of things that you would change in order to make the city actually be a better city for young children? I love this picture because it actually represents, and I think, Sarah, many of your pictures were also like just like capturing this very beautiful moments where you can tell that children are enjoying. You can just like imagine what they're feeling through the pictures we can collect in these very special places that can be in any city around the world. But I think that what we're trying to answer to this question, we're trying to think is children and caregivers definitely have a different experience in cities, because the needs of a caregiver and the needs of babies and toddlers and the very young children in any city around the world are very different from any other age in life. And if we understand this, then we can understand how we can design or plan our cities in a different way, where we can really influence the kind of behaviors that we want to promote in any given city. And what we usually do when we work in cities, and just to mention that right now, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation is working with around 76 cities around the world. And what we try to do is we partner cities and we try to find which are the cross-sectorial ways that we can work in the urban space that can really improve the life of children. And when we're talking about improving the life of children, we're working on 3 very specific areas, because of course, when we talk about urban planning and design, there can be many different areas of that are relevant to the well-being of children. But we're really trying to center a lot of our work in these very 3 strategic areas. So the first is around public space, which is very relevant to the talk that we're having today, because I think it has to do with all these public spaces that are good for children. And so we're talking about streets, about parks, sidewalks, plazas, playgrounds, any public space where we can promote positive interactions between caregivers and children, but also between children and nature, and between what happens in any public space. Then the mobility, which is also very close related to the public space, because as we were seeing, and I especially like Tim's graphic, just showing how limited the mobility of many children around the world can be nowadays, if we compare it to our own childhood, and how much more free we could be on moving and feeling safe in many different cities, and how this is actually changing at a very fast rate. And then finally, but not least, I think that thinking about neighborhood planning and thinking which is the specific data that we want to understand better in order to provide better access, because I was reading at the chat and some of the concerns of the chat. I think one of the things that we've also learned through the pandemic is that we have huge gaps in every city around the world, right? Like there are definitely some neighborhoods that can have great access to green and blue infrastructure, but there are some neighborhoods that are much more vulnerable, and where actually accessing good green and blue infrastructure is very difficult. So just asking that question and trying to understand why it is important to close this gap and ensure more green areas in every neighborhood around the city is so important when we're talking about the well-being of children. I love to share this slide because I think it's also important to remind everyone, and I don't know how many of you know, but what actually happens in the brain of a baby during the first 2 years of life is that they're making up to 1 million connections per second. And this sounds like crazy, but it's actually true. Like there's a lot of like scientific evidence proving nowadays that during the first 2 years of life, we're building all this like brain connections that are going to ensure the well-being of children in their adult life. So if we want to ensure like a good start for all children, we got to make sure that the connections that we're creating in the urban space are positive connections that have to do with not only between the connections between caregivers and young children, but actually the connections that we can influence from the built environment, so caregivers can connect to each other, so children can connect with nature. And I think, Sarah, again, you were showing some amazing examples of how children can really connect to nature, but also how children can connect to all these different ways of getting different stimulation through different areas in any city. I want to share a couple of examples because as I was telling you, we're currently working in 76 cities, but I think we have learned a lot by implementation. And I want to share why, for example, just thinking on design for well-being is so important when we're thinking from the young children's perspective. This is the example of some of the tactical interventions that Lima has done. And I always like sharing this example because I think it's very concrete on how you can improve the situation of a very vulnerable neighborhood in a city like Lima that has over 11 million inhabitants. And you can start prioritizing public space for young children, and you can start like making spaces for people more important than spaces for cars. So these pictures again illustrate like how you can easily, and these are like low cost interventions that can completely transform the access to good public space. And this can basically ensure some of these positive connections that I was talking about. But I also want to share some of the things that are happening in Addis Abeba. So when we're thinking again about how can we transform this idea of design, and for example, just like transforming the use of streets, which is what's currently happening in Addis Abeba, is that they've decided to use 20 streets of Addis Abeba and close the streets in order to make the streets a better place for play. So this is not like a permanent intervention. It happens like once every week, but I think that the fact that the authority of Addis Abeba is like realizing how important it is to use the public space for play is amazing. I also want to share this other example, and this for me is a very important learning on how the design is so important when we talk about caregiving. This is a park that was recently designed in Tel Aviv. We've been doing a lot of work in Tel Aviv. But for me, this idea of how we can transform the way that we design parks so children can actually be more in contact with different elements of nature. So as you can see in this picture, it's basically enabling different elements to be part of this experience that children need when they are connected to nature. But not only being good for children, but actually being good for caregivers, because they're also enjoying this time in nature and this positive connections that they can do because the environment and the built environment is also enabling this kind of connections. This is another example in India, and it's a flyover under space, and again, designing in order to improve caregiving is so important. What you see here is actually, this is one of the Angawari centers, which is like a daycare center in India, which was already placed in this very specific urban space, which was definitely not like a very engaging or nurturing space. So the fact that we could transform the public space that was right next to this Angawari center is also showing us how important it is to design in order to enable this positive caregiving. So never forget, if you're an urban designer, how important it is to think about not only the service, but actually how we can improve the environment of this service in order to really influence these positive interactions. Design for equity, and for me, this is coming from a country like Ecuador. Of course, this is for me one of the biggest challenges that we have in most of our cities, which is really making sure that when we're making any of these tactical interventions in cities, we start making these interventions in the most vulnerable areas of our cities, because we can decide where to do these interventions. And many times we want to do these interventions in the most popular sites of a city. But in reality, what we need to think is, how are we going to reach those families, or how are we going to be able to influence and close these gaps on the neighborhoods that actually don't have any access to good public space? So lots of learnings in this specific topic. Again, the work that we're doing in India in around 20 different cities has been really inspiring, and it has really taught us a lot on how to really choose different specific areas of cities that can make the difference in order to create these opportunities for the most vulnerable areas of cities. I'm also referring to Tirana, and I know that Tim also referred to Tirana, but again, and just referring to some of the comments that Tim was doing, I think one of the biggest changes that has really enabled to transform the city of Tirana has been the political will to actually really do all these policies thinking about the future of Tirana. So I've heard the mayor say different times, I want the city of Tirana to be a playground itself. So he's not just thinking about building playgrounds all over the city, but he wants the city to feel like a playground. He wants the city to feel like a safe place where children and adults can interact and can play and can feel safe. But I really like this intervention, which is around mobility and trying to influence the behaviors of very young children and from very early stages, which is actually teaching young kids how to bike and how to feel safe when they wander around the city. And I think this is amazing because behaviors is also about like creating these habits. And the earlier we can create these habits, the better for the city, because maybe this can really enable sustainable mobility in the future. The other very important concept is proximity matters. This is again an example in Tel Aviv. This was a neighborhood that didn't have any like access to close by parks. And again, the fact that they were able to transform a place that was a place where basically cars were massively parked into a playground was one of the best decisions that was done in the municipality of Tel Aviv. Again, just prioritizing people's needs, right? They realized that the distance that families needed to walk or just like move in order to access a good playground was huge. So why not really transforming the spaces that were dedicated to cars to spaces that could create this well-being for families and people? And at the beginning, there was a lot of resistance because, of course, this also is touching on where am I going to park, like on a lot of commodities that people and citizens are used to have. But at the end, when families started being part of the design of the playground and really understood which were some of the benefits that they were getting by investing in this infrastructure, it was a huge success. This last picture is also just showing what I really think it's kind of like basically taking into a picture the slide that I was showing before, right? Which is around the connections that we want to be able to create in any public space. And I want to refer again about these positive connections because I really think this is not about making sure that these positive connections are good for the development of brains and well-being of young children, but it's actually good for all of us. So think about this picture. Think about what's happening between caregivers and young children. Think about what's happening between young children themselves. They're experiencing different elements of nature, but they're also relating to each other. Think about what's happening with how children are getting into the park with their bikes or with their strollers and walking, and they're able to see other people, other pets. So for me, just the dynamic of this picture and what's capturing is just like really illustrating this kind of positive connections that we really want to influence the urban space to enable, just because this is what we need as human beings, is just create these positive memories that can have a very positive impact in the way that we develop. This is Jundiaí, which is another city in Brazil that we're working. And here again, what I like about this intervention is that they're using natural elements. And this is quite new in the case of Brazil. So instead of using the typical playground elements that were used in the city, the mayor has decided to explore, and this is more related to what Tim and Sarah were referring to, is like incorporating more natural elements into the way that we design this like play areas. And it has been incredibly successful. Here we see not necessarily dedicated to very young children, but I think that the fact that other children are also enjoying this space is very positive. Maybe just to summarize, for me, again, it's all we have to do when we think about Urban 95 and just like encourage urban planners and architects and engineers and anybody who's making any decisions around how to improve the environments where children grow, is we need to ensure that these environments can be safe and healthy. And of course, I think it's important to think about the access and how we can make the access easy for everyone, because this is one of the biggest gaps that we have in all of our cities. But we really want to make sure that any kind of space that we're designing can really promote frequent, warm, and responsive interactions. And I want to emphasize again on this because I think this is my main message. If we want to ensure like a well-being for young children, we have to be able to create these special and magic moments for positive interactions. And finally, just to mention one of the things that we've learned through supporting governments and local governments, it's we do need to have very good and reliable data that is able to picture young children, because this is one of the biggest gaps that we see in most cities. And Gill, I think you were referring to the fact that in most cities we get indicators and metrics on older children, but very little on younger children and caregivers and what's happening with them. The other thing, it's very important to start using behavioral science to try to understand better which are the different behaviors that we want to encourage in the public space. Do we want to encourage like more play? Do we want to encourage more positive interactions between caregivers and young children? Do we want to encourage more active mobility? What is it that from the public policy perspective we're trying to encourage through the work that we do at a city level? And finally, I think there's a lot of important learnings on how important it is to work with the capacity building that we have, especially in the local governments. And this has to do, again, with making sure that when we're working at a city level, we also start working across sectors. So we start working to influence urban planners on understanding better the social science behind early childhood development, and the other way around. It's also important for the early childhood experts to learn more about the importance of urban planning. I think this was all on my side, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people participating in this panel might have. Thank you.
I wish I had done a full program with each one of you, but on the other hand, the synergy of having the three of you was really magical. One of the best sessions. I have enjoyed. I have learned from each one of you. I hope that everyone that has connected from around the world also has enjoyed it. And I want to thank you for having accepted the invitation. And I invite the three of you and everybody else that in 2 weeks, we're going to see the end of our lives, the last third of our life, which could be much happier and healthier. And again, whatever we do for older adults is not just because it's good for them. If it's good for the older adults, it's going to be good for everybody. So at the end of the day, there are a lot of similarities. Thank you very, very much for having accepted the invitation. Also, thank you for all the energy and work that each one of you put in your everyday activities, because each one of you are contributing lots to create a better world for everyone. And the last message is each one of you talked about equity, and every single example that was shown could be done everywhere. It's not an issue of money. These are not technical issues. These are not financial issues. It's more political issues. So elections matter, democracy matters, priorities matter. Thank you very, very much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, Gill. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Gill. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.